The year was 1066, a time when kingdoms trembled under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and the clash of steel on blood-soaked fields. That fateful year would etch itself into the memory of Europe forever, for it was a year of invasions, rival claims to the English throne, and a sequence of battles that determined the course of history. Among those legendary moments, the day of September 25, 1066, stands out as one of the most dramatic and almost unbelievable episodes ever recorded. The day when 10,000 hardened Viking warriors seemingly vanished within a single hour at Stamford Bridge. This was not only the end of a Viking invasion but also the symbolic collapse of an age, a moment that marked the dying roar of Norse dominance over Europe and the emergence of a new order. The story begins with King Edward the Confessor of England, whose death in January of 1066 left the English throne without a direct heir. The resulting chaos invited contenders from across the seas. Harald Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, was crowned King of England almost immediately, claiming Edward had promised him the crown. But his claim was challenged by William, Duke of Normandy, who argued Edward had earlier promised it to him and that Harald had even sworn an oath of loyalty. Across the North Sea, another man staked his claim, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a fierce and legendary warrior who believed the English crown was his by ancient agreements between Norse and Anglo-Saxon rulers. Hardrada's reputation was such that he had been called the Thunderbolt of the North, a man who had carved a career as a mercenary, raider, and conqueror before ruling Norway with an iron hand. He gathered a massive fleet, estimated at over 300 ships, and assembled an army of around 10,000 men, reinforced by Harald Godwinson's own exiled brother Tostig, who sought revenge against Harald and the English nobles who had driven him out. The Vikings swept into northern England with devastating speed. They crushed an English army at the Battle of Fulford on September 20, near York, where thousands of Saxons were slain and the Norse forces seemed unstoppable. Victorious and confident, Harald Hardrada demanded submission from the local lords. York surrendered, and plans were laid for the formal exchange of hostages and supplies at a crossing point along the River Derwent, near Stamford Bridge. For the Vikings, it must have felt like destiny, the crown of England within their grasp, their enemies scattered, their ships secure along the Humber estuary. They had no reason to expect what would happen next. King Harald Godwinson had been in the south, preparing for the looming threat of William's invasion from Normandy. But upon hearing of the Viking landing, he reacted with astonishing speed. He marched his army northward, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, a feat of endurance that remains one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval history. His men were exhausted, but their loyalty was unwavering, for they knew the future of England hung in the balance. Harold's spies reported the Vikings were camped near Stamford Bridge, unsuspecting and relaxed, many not even wearing armor because they believed the local English had already submitted. The element of surprise was complete. On the morning of September 25, under a blazing late summer sun, Harold's army appeared on the horizon. Dust rose in thick clouds as thousands of Saxon soldiers advanced in full battle array. For the Vikings, it was a nightmare vision. Many were lounging by the riverside, their armor left aboard the ships miles away. Others had gone off in small groups to forage. When they saw the vast English host marching upon them, panic spread like fire through the camp. The Norse had expected a peaceful handover of hostages, instead, they faced annihilation. Yet Vikings were nothing if not fierce in battle, and under the leadership of Harald Hardrada, they scrambled to form a shield wall across the narrow crossing at Stamford Bridge. One of the most famous tales from that day tells of a lone Viking berserker who stood upon the wooden bridge itself, wielding a massive two-handed axe. With insane courage, he held off the entire English advance for precious minutes, cutting down warrior after warrior who tried to cross. Arrows rained upon him, spears thrust at him, yet he stood like a giant, buying his comrades time to form ranks on the far side of the river. According to legend, he killed 40 men before finally being brought down by a soldier who crept beneath the bridge and thrust a spear upward into his body. Whether the tale was exaggerated or not, it perfectly symbolized the desperate bravery of the Norsemen that day. Once across the bridge, Harold's English army slammed into the Viking lines with terrifying force. The Saxons, fueled by the urgency of defending their homeland, fought with a savagery that even the Vikings had rarely encountered. The Vikings tried to hold their shield wall, but without armor and scattered across the fields, many were slaughtered before they could even reach formation. The battle became a chaotic frenzy of steel and blood. The riverbanks ran red as men were cut down in droves. The once proud Norse army, which had seemed invincible just days earlier, was suddenly trapped in a fight for survival. Harald Hardrada himself, towering and fearsome, fought at the front, wielding his sword with both hands. He was said to have struck down men left and right, his war cry echoing above the din. But fate was not on his side. An arrow pierced his throat, killing him almost instantly. The death of the great Viking king shattered the morale of his warriors. Yet Tostig, Harald Godwinson's brother, refused to surrender. He took command and urged the men to fight on. When Harald offered him quarter, Tostig spat in defiance, choosing death over surrender. He too fell in the melee, struck down by English blades. As the battle raged, the Vikings attempted one last desperate stand. Surrounded on all sides, they fought like cornered wolves, their axes and swords flashing in the sunlight. But the English numbers were overwhelming, and exhaustion gripped the Norsemen. By the end of the day, the fields around Stamford Bridge were littered with bodies. Of the 10,000 Vikings who had set foot on English soil, only a fraction survived. Contemporary accounts suggest that just 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway, compared to the hundreds that had arrived. In a single day, in perhaps little more than an hour of intense slaughter, the Viking dream of conquering England was extinguished. The scale of the Viking defeat was almost beyond comprehension. It was not only a catastrophic loss of life but also the symbolic end of the Viking Age. For centuries, Norse raiders had terrorized Europe, sacking towns, plundering monasteries, and carving out kingdoms from Ireland to Russia. They had been the scourge of Christendom, their dragon-headed ships haunting the coasts from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. But after Stamford Bridge, the era of Viking expansion was over. Norway itself would be shaken, and its kings would never again mount such an ambitious overseas invasion. The thunderbolt of the north had been extinguished. For Harald Godwinson, the victory was total but came at a terrible cost. His army, though triumphant, was battered, exhausted, and weakened. They had marched hundreds of miles, fought a massive battle, and suffered losses of their own. The timing could not have been worse, for even as the corpses of Vikings cooled on the fields of Yorkshire, William of Normandy was preparing to land his own invasion force in the south. Within days, Harald would be forced to march his weary army all the way back down to meet this new threat. Less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harald's fate would be sealed at the Battle of Hastings, where he fell beneath Norman cavalry and archers, and England itself would pass into the hands of William the Conqueror. Yet Stamford Bridge remains an astonishing testament to the drama of 1066. In that single hour of battle, an entire Viking host was destroyed, a legendary king was slain, and a chapter of history was closed. For the men who survived, the memory of that day must have haunted them forever, the screams of dying comrades, the sight of the great Harald Hardrada collapsing with an arrow through his throat, the river clogged with corpses, the bloodied field littered with broken shields and bent swords. It was a massacre, yes, but also a turning point. The world of the Old Norse gods and sea kings was giving way to the feudal kingdoms of medieval Europe. Legends of Stamford Bridge lived on for centuries. Chroniclers describe the battle as one of the fiercest ever fought on English soil. The lone Viking on the bridge became a symbol of defiance, a story retold across generations as an example of Norse courage. Songs and sagas spoke of Hardrada's last stand, painting him as a tragic hero who sought to claim a crown but found only death. In England, the battle became a symbol of Harald Godwinson's strength and resilience, even though his glory was short-lived. In Norway, it was remembered as a national tragedy, the day when thousands of sons never returned, the day when a great king fell. The disappearance of 10,000 Vikings in 1 hour may sound like an exaggeration, but in truth it reflected the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Battles were often decided quickly once one side broke ranks, and the slaughter of fleeing men could be horrific. At Stamford Bridge, the combination of surprise, exhaustion, and disorganization doomed the Norse. Once their leaders fell, panic spread, and the English showed no mercy. The survivors who limped back to their ships carried stories of horror that would echo across the fjords of Norway for generations. To imagine the scene is to step into a nightmare. Picture thousands of warriors in gleaming mail and leather, suddenly confronted by an enemy host charging at them with swords, axes, and spears. Picture the confusion as men scrambled to grab weapons, only to be cut down before they could form up. Picture the cries of the wounded, the clash of steel on shields, the sickening thud of arrows finding their mark. And then picture the sudden silence after the storm, as the battlefield lay still, littered with the dead and dying, the crows already circling overhead. Such was the fate of the Viking army that day. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was more than just a military engagement, it was a hinge of history. Had Hardrada won, England's destiny might have been forever altered. A Norse dynasty might have ruled, changing the culture, the language, and perhaps even preventing the Norman Conquest. Instead, his defeat cleared the stage for William of Normandy, whose victory at Hastings ushered in a new era. The English language itself would be transformed, absorbing French influences, and the shape of the English nation would be set on a course that eventually led to empire. And so, the day when 10,000 Vikings disappeared in 1 hour remains one of the most astonishing episodes in the annals of war. It was the death of an army, the end of an age, and the prelude to one of the most famous battles in history. Stamford Bridge was not just a clash of kings but a collision of worlds, the Old Norse world of raiders and sea kings against the emerging medieval kingdoms of Europe. When the dust settled and the last ship sailed back to Norway, the world was forever changed. 1. Death of Edward the Confessor and the disputed English throne in 1066. When King Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, England was thrown into a political storm. Edward, who had ruled for more than 2 decades, left no direct heir. This single fact opened a dangerous void, inviting ambitious men across Europe to lay claim to the throne. His reign had been marked by piety and relative peace, but also by reliance on powerful nobles like Harald Godwinson. Edward's passing without children meant his promises and alliances during life would now ignite conflict. England was wealthy and strategically vital, making the crown one of the most coveted prizes in medieval Europe. With its fertile land, prosperous towns, and growing influence, it became a beacon for foreign rulers. 3 claimants emerged almost instantly: Harald Godwinson of Wessex, William of Normandy, and Harald Hardrada of Norway. Edward's death thus became the spark that would lead to one of the most eventful years in European history. 2. Harald Godwinson crowned King of England and rival claims by William of Normandy and Harald Hardrada. Shortly after Edward's death, the Witenejma, the English Council of Nobles, chose Harald Godwinson as king. He was Edward's brother-in-law, the most powerful earl in England, and a proven leader. But his coronation on January 6 angered rival claimants. William of Normandy asserted that Edward had once promised him the throne and claimed Harald had sworn an oath of loyalty to support his succession. Across the sea in Norway, Harald Hardrada believed he had a legal right through an old agreement between earlier Norse and English rulers. Each man saw himself as the rightful king, and none intended to yield peacefully. Harald's swift coronation was meant to secure stability, but instead it provoked 2 massive invasions, first from the north by Hardrada and then from the south by William. The stage was set for a year of battles, betrayals, and unprecedented upheaval that would decide the fate of England for centuries. 3. Harald Hardrada's reputation as a legendary Viking warrior and conqueror. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was not an ordinary claimant but a warrior of legendary stature. Known as the Thunderbolt of the North, he had fought as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, battled in distant lands, and returned home to rule Norway with ferocity. Towering in stature and feared on the battlefield, Hardrada embodied the Viking spirit of conquest. His name carried a sense of inevitability. When he declared war, it felt like destiny. In Norse tradition, kings were warriors first, and Hardrada was perhaps the greatest of his age. His ambition for the English throne was not only political but personal. He saw it as the culmination of his life's exploits. To his followers, the English crown was within reach, and their king's invincible reputation gave them unshakable confidence. Yet his thirst for conquest would lead him to one of the bloodiest defeats in Viking history at Stamford Bridge. 4. Tostig Godwinson's alliance with Hardrada against his own brother Harald. Harald Godwinson's greatest challenge did not only come from foreign rivals but from within his own family. His exiled brother Tostig, once Earl of Northumbria, nursed a bitter grudge after being driven out by local rebellion and Harald's failure to support him. Fueled by revenge, Tostig sought allies and found in Harald Hardrada the perfect partner. Together they plotted to topple Harald and divide England's riches. For Tostig, it was an act of vengeance; for Hardrada, an opportunity for conquest. This betrayal gave Hardrada valuable knowledge of English politics and geography, making his invasion more dangerous. Tostig's presence also demoralized Harald Godwinson, who faced the torment of fighting against his own blood. When the armies clashed, Harald even offered Tostig forgiveness and restoration of lands if he surrendered, but Tostig refused. His loyalty to Hardrada sealed his fate, and both brothers would meet their deaths in the same year, on opposite sides of the battlefield. 5. The Viking invasion fleet of more than 300 ships carrying around 10,000 men. In late summer 1066, Hardrada launched his invasion. His fleet of over 300 dragon-headed ships cut across the North Sea, a sight that must have filled English hearts with dread. On board were around 10,000 hardened warriors, Norse veterans, mercenaries, and opportunists drawn by promises of plunder. The scale of the armada rivaled any in Viking history, resembling the legendary expeditions that had terrorized Europe for centuries. Landing along the Humber estuary, they quickly marched inland, spreading fear and destruction. Their arrival was not only a military operation but a statement that the old Viking power still lived. For many in England, it was as if the ghost of the Viking age had returned in full force. Yet, despite its grandeur, the fleet would become a floating graveyard. By the end of September, only a fraction of those ships would carry survivors back to Norway, the rest forever tied to a field of corpses at Stamford Bridge. 6. The Viking victory at the Battle of Fulford on September 20, 1066. The first clash between Hardrada and the English came at Fulford, near York, on September 20. The Earls of Northumbria and Mercia, Edwin and Morcar, attempted to block the Norse advance. Their forces, though valiant, were outmatched. The Vikings formed a solid shield wall and smashed through the English lines, killing thousands and scattering survivors. The defeat at Fulford was devastating, leaving northern England vulnerable. For the Vikings, it was a triumphant start, reinforcing their belief that the English crown was within reach. York, the richest city in the north, soon surrendered to Hardrada. Confidence soared among the Norse, who now planned to consolidate their hold. Fulford demonstrated Hardrada's skill and the ferocity of his men. Yet, the victory planted the seeds of complacency. Believing the English king would be too far away to respond quickly, the Vikings relaxed their guard. It was a fatal miscalculation that would undo them just 5 days later. 7. York's surrender to the Vikings and plans for hostage exchange. Following their victory at Fulford, the Vikings marched into York. The city, weakened and fearful, chose surrender rather than further bloodshed. Hardrada demanded supplies, hostages, and oaths of loyalty, signaling his intent to rule the north. An agreement was made that the exchange of hostages would occur at Stamford Bridge, a river crossing east of York, on September 25. For the Vikings, it was the next step in consolidating their conquest. They believed King Harald Godwinson was still in the south, preoccupied with William of Normandy, and therefore no immediate threat. Many Norse warriors removed their armor, left behind in camp or aboard ships, and lounged in the late summer sun, confident of their control. They saw Stamford Bridge as a ceremonial formality, not a battlefield. That assumption, underestimating Harald's speed and determination, would prove disastrous. What they expected to be a simple exchange of hostages would turn into the site of their annihilation. 8. Harald Godwinson's forced march of nearly 200 miles in 4 days. While the Vikings rested, Harald Godwinson performed one of the most remarkable feats in medieval military history. Upon learning of Hardrada's invasion, he gathered his army and marched nearly 200 miles from London to York in just 4 days. The speed was extraordinary, medieval armies typically moved at a fraction of that pace. His men, hardened but weary, pushed through fatigue because they knew the survival of England depended on it. This grueling march gave Harald the element of surprise, as neither Hardrada nor Tostig could have imagined such a rapid response. By the time the English army appeared near Stamford Bridge on September 25, the Vikings were completely unprepared. Harald's decision to strike swiftly prevented Hardrada from consolidating control and forced the decisive confrontation. Though this march weakened his troops, it demonstrated Harald's leadership and urgency, securing a legendary victory before fate turned against him weeks later at Hastings. 9. The Viking army unprepared at Stamford Bridge, many without armor. The morning of September 25 was unusually hot for northern England, with the sun blazing across the fields near Stamford Bridge. The Vikings, expecting only a peaceful meeting for hostage exchange, left much of their armor behind. Many were lounging, unarmed and half-dressed, when Harald's army suddenly appeared on the horizon. Panic spread through the camp. Warriors scrambled to form lines, but without chainmail, helmets, and shields, they were exposed. Some rushed back toward the ships miles away, while others grabbed whatever weapons they could. The famed Viking shield wall, usually a nearly impenetrable defense, was hastily assembled and weaker than normal. Against Harald's disciplined and heavily armed Saxons, the disadvantage was catastrophic. The element of surprise, coupled with the Vikings' lack of preparation, ensured they faced overwhelming slaughter. Their overconfidence after Fulford had lulled them into complacency, turning what should have been a strong defensive stand into a disastrous rout. 10. The famous lone Viking holding the bridge with a massive axe. Among the most enduring legends of Stamford Bridge is that of the lone Viking berserker who stood upon the wooden bridge, facing the entire English advance. Armed with a massive two-handed Dane axe, he cut down warrior after warrior who tried to cross. His ferocity stalled the English for precious minutes, allowing the Norse to form ranks on the far side of the river. Chroniclers claimed he killed 40 men before he was finally brought down, either by arrows or by a soldier who crept under the bridge and thrust a spear upward into him. Whether exaggerated or not, the story symbolized Viking bravery and refusal to yield. His sacrifice, though futile, became a tale sung in sagas, an image of defiance against overwhelming odds. For the English, it was a frustrating obstacle. For the Vikings, it was a final example of the heroic spirit that defined their culture. 11. The English crossing and brutal collapse of the Viking shield wall. Once the lone Viking on the bridge was finally slain, Harald Godwinson's army poured across the river. The Saxons advanced in disciplined ranks, their shields locked and spears bristling forward. On the far side, the Vikings attempted to form their own shield wall, but without proper armor and with their line hastily arranged, it soon buckled under the English onslaught. The clash was deafening, steel crashing against wood, men screaming as swords bit into flesh. The Saxons pressed relentlessly, driving wedges into the Viking formation and splitting them apart. Once gaps appeared, the defense collapsed, and the battlefield descended into chaos. Individual skirmishes replaced organized combat, with groups of Norsemen cut down piecemeal. The disciplined English advantage overwhelmed the exhausted Vikings. What had begun as a bold attempt to resist turned into a massacre. The famed Norse shield wall, legendary for centuries, finally failed at Stamford Bridge in a storm of blood and iron. 12. Harald Hardrada's death by an arrow through his throat. In the heat of battle, Harald Hardrada himself fought at the front, towering above his men. He swung his sword with terrifying strength, cutting down any who came near, his voice rising above the roar of combat like a battle horn. Yet even the mightiest warrior is not invincible. As the Saxon archers loosed volleys of arrows, one found its mark, striking Hardrada in the throat. The great Viking king collapsed, choking on blood, his final roar silenced. His fall was catastrophic for Norse morale. For decades, Hardrada had been considered almost untouchable, a living legend whose presence alone inspired courage. To see him lifeless on the battlefield was to see the dream die. Many Vikings fought on in blind rage, but others faltered, despair taking hold. Hardrada's death marked not just the loss of a leader but the symbolic end of Viking dominance in England, extinguished in a single arrow's flight. 13. Tostig's refusal to surrender and his death in battle. With Hardrada slain, Harald Godwinson offered his estranged brother Tostig a chance to surrender. He promised to restore Tostig's earldom and lands if he abandoned the Norse cause. It was an extraordinary moment, for Harald was willing to forgive betrayal in the hope of avoiding further bloodshed. But Tostig's pride and bitterness would not allow it. He spat in defiance, rejecting the offer, and urged his men to fight to the death. In the chaos of battle, Tostig fought with determination but was soon struck down. His refusal to reconcile sealed his fate, and the Godwinson brothers' rivalry ended with one on the throne and the other lying dead on the field. Tostig's loyalty to Hardrada and hatred for Harald ensured the Viking army would be annihilated rather than preserved. His stubbornness epitomized the ruthless family feuds of the age, where ambition and vengeance outweighed blood ties, even in the face of destruction. 14. The massacre of the Viking army, with only 24 ships needed to carry survivors home. The slaughter at Stamford Bridge was total. Of the approximately 10,000 Norsemen who had sailed to England in over 300 ships, only a fraction survived. Chroniclers noted that just 24 ships were needed to carry the broken remnants back to Norway. The scale of loss was unimaginable. Bodies carpeted the fields, piled along the riverbank, and floated downstream. The stench of death lingered for weeks. For the survivors, it was a haunting memory, watching comrades hacked down, leaders slain, and the proud Viking host annihilated in less than a day. Families back in Norway waited for fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. It was one of the bloodiest defeats in Viking history, and its swiftness shocked even hardened warriors. The disappearance of 10,000 men in just one battle, almost in a single hour of concentrated fighting, became a grim legend, remembered as the moment the Norse power in England evaporated forever. 15. The symbolic end of the Viking Age after Stamford Bridge. Historians often point to Stamford Bridge as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. For nearly 3 centuries, Norse raiders had terrorized Europe, their dragon ships haunting the coasts from Ireland to Russia. They had carved kingdoms in Normandy, Sicily, and the Danelaw of England. But Stamford Bridge broke their momentum. The defeat shattered Norway's ability to project power abroad. It marked the last great Viking invasion of England. Though Viking influence lingered culturally and politically, their military dominance was finished. After this battle, no Scandinavian king would ever again send such a massive host across the seas in pursuit of conquest. The death of Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, was symbolic of the fading Norse warrior ethos. The world was moving into a new era of feudal kings and centralized kingdoms, leaving behind the age of raiders and sea kings. Stamford Bridge was the Viking world's final, thunderous roar. 16. Harald Godwinson's army weakened despite victory. Though Harald Godwinson's victory at Stamford Bridge was complete, it came at a terrible cost. His army was battered, bloodied, and exhausted from the forced march north and the brutal day-long battle. Many of his best warriors lay dead among the Norse, and those who survived were weary from constant fighting. The triumph felt hollow, for Harald knew the danger was not over. Even as he celebrated, word reached him that William of Normandy had landed in the south with a vast army. Now Harald faced an impossible choice: rest and regroup, or march immediately to confront this new threat. Bound by duty and the urgency of defense, he chose the latter. Thus, his men, barely recovered from Stamford Bridge, would be forced into another grueling march. The victory over the Vikings, though glorious, left him too weakened to face the Normans at Hastings just 3 weeks later. 17. William of Normandy's invasion arriving soon after. While Harald fought and bled at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy prepared his invasion. Backed by the Pope and a coalition of Norman, Breton, and Flemish allies, he sailed across the Channel with a massive fleet. His timing was perfect. With Harold's army in the north, William landed unopposed on the Sussex coast in late September. He established a base at Hastings, pillaging the surrounding countryside to provoke Harald into a swift response. William was an experienced commander, cunning and ruthless, and he knew Harold's forces were stretched thin. When news reached Harald of William's landing, he had little choice but to march south once again. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide England's fate. William's arrival so soon after Stamford Bridge was a cruel twist of destiny, for it forced Harald into battle before his men could rest, and ultimately led to the Saxon king's downfall. 18. Harold's forced march south to face William. Barely had the blood dried at Stamford Bridge when Harald Godwinson turned his weary army south. The march back from York to London was as punishing as the one northward, and many soldiers fell behind or deserted from exhaustion. Yet Harald pressed forward, knowing that every day he delayed gave William of Normandy more time to entrench. The army that trudged toward Hastings was a shadow of the force that had crushed the Vikings, still courageous, but worn down, depleted, and stretched thin. The Saxons had to fight 2 full-scale invasions within weeks, a nearly impossible task. Harold's leadership and determination were undeniable, but the strain was overwhelming. His men carried not only physical wounds but also mental scars from the carnage at Stamford Bridge. By the time they faced William, they were valiant but diminished, setting the stage for one of the most consequential defeats in English history. 19. The Battle of Hastings and Harold's death. On October 14, 1066, less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harald Godwinson faced William at Hastings. The Saxon shield wall held firm for most of the day, repelling Norman cavalry and archers. But exhaustion and attrition took their toll. Feigned retreats lured Saxons into breaking formation, and volleys of arrows rained down relentlessly. In the chaos, Harald himself was struck down, famously said to have been pierced by an arrow to the eye, though accounts vary. His death broke Saxon resistance, and the Normans surged forward to claim victory. The fall of Harald marked not only the end of his dynasty but also the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. The Norman conquest reshaped the culture, language, and governance of the land. Thus, the victory at Stamford Bridge, though brilliant, was overshadowed by the crushing defeat at Hastings, which determined the course of English history for centuries to come. 20. The long-term impact of Stamford Bridge on England, Norway, and European history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge had far-reaching consequences. For England, it was both a triumph and a tragedy, proof of Harald's strength, but also the reason he was too weakened to repel the Normans. For Norway, it was a catastrophe that ended its ambitions abroad. The loss of so many warriors crippled its military and left scars on its society. The Viking Age, already waning, effectively ended with Hardrada's death. For Europe, Stamford Bridge was part of the turning point of 1066, the year that reshaped the continent. The defeat of the Vikings and the Norman victory at Hastings created a new balance of power. England became more connected to continental Europe, its language and culture transformed, while Scandinavia turned inward. The story of 10,000 Vikings disappearing in one terrible day remains a haunting reminder of how quickly fortunes can change in war and how single battles can alter the destiny of nations.